Good morning and hello, Frankfort. I'm Amanda Cook, a member of Frankfort VFW Post 1493. On behalf of the Post, thank you for joining us here today for our Memorial Day ceremony. We are pleased to be able to honor our own in this unique way. On Memorial Day, we take the day to remember those who died in service to our nation, and those who served with honor and have since passed. We have gathered here in special tribute to those who made the ultimate sacrifice while serving in our armed forces, to whom we owe the deepest gratitude. Our ceremony will begin with a prayer from Reverend Dale Marshall, formerly of St. Peter's Church.
Let us pray. Gracious and loving God, we thank you for the opportunity to come. For indeed, those men and those women who over the years have served in a beautiful fashion, some even giving their lives, we thank you for their service as well. So help us to realize that here as your congregation today, we have opportunities to serve, to feed those that need some food, to house those that need some place to live, to indeed believe that we are your children here on earth, to give examples of your Son, the living Christ, still in our midst. So bless us, Lord, and help us to be thankful for those that served in so many different ways and continue to serve even this day. We remember not only the dead, but those who are currently working this day as nurses, as helpers, as the military, to the glory of the peaceful Christ who came to show us how to live and to love and to forgive. Amen.
Thank you very much, Reverend. I want to now turn our attention to Commander Al Gutierrez as he lowers the flag to half-mast as a sign of respect for those who have passed. Each year, we also place a wreath below the flag on our memorial to the armed services in remembrance of those veterans who have passed. This year, the wreath is presented by Vicki Gress of the VFW Ladies Auxiliary. Thank you for all you do for our veterans and for memorializing our fallen today. We will now hear the Star-Spangled Banner performed by the Hickory Creek Middle School Band under the direction of Doug Adams, Allison Bowman, and Shannon Shanahan. Please stand.
Stripes and
Wonderful job. Thank you for your performance and the participation in our Memorial Day ceremony this year. Our mayor, Keith Ogle, has prepared a special address for our community on this solemn day.
Thank you for joining us today. I am Mayor Keith Ogle. On this Memorial Day in Frankfort, we remember and honor deceased veterans, and we reflect on the sacrifices that soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, and Coast Guard men and women make for us. During the American Civil War, people periodically brought flowers to cemeteries to decorate the graves of those who had died in battle. These decoration days became common at cemeteries in both north and southern states. Shortly after the Civil War hostilities ended, an Illinois general, John Logan, who served as commander-in-chief of the Grand Army in Washington, issued an order creating the first Memorial Day. The order directed that on May 30th, 1868, the graves of soldiers who were buried at Arlington Cemetery and who had died during the war between the states were to be decorated with flowers. Over the years, Memorial Day became a time to remember all deceased veterans. In 1971, the United States Congress passed the National Holiday Act, which declared the last Monday in May as Memorial Day. The Frankfort community was just 13 years old when the first Memorial Day was observed in 1868. Frankfort continues to observe Memorial Day by decorating the graves of veterans in our local cemeteries. Today, we also reflect on the ideals and values which make people serve in the military. Our country would not be the great nation that it is without the men and women of our armed forces who have sacrificed and continue to sacrifice the comforts of home and family to protect and defend our United States. Today, we honor deceased veterans, and we also thank the men and women who are currently serving in our armed forces, and we pray for their safe return. For many years, our Frankfort VFW has sponsored this Memorial Day event. I thank members of the VFW for their ongoing crusade to assist our servicemen, women, and their families. I thank the members of the Hickory Creek Middle School Band and their musical directors, Doug Adams, Allison Bauman, and Shannon Shanahan, for their musical contribution to today's ceremony. We thank our police chief, Leanne Chalepis, and our Frankfort Police Department, as well as the Frankfort Fire Department, for their participation today. I'd also like to recognize our village trustee, Maura Ragoni, for her attendance. This Memorial Day, while we are away from work and school, let us remember how fortunate we are that we live in a free nation. Let us remember that we rely on our own sons and daughters to defend our liberty. We thank those who currently serve in the armed forces for their contribution to our security. We thank those who have previously served in the armed forces, and we thank those who gave their lives for our liberty. May God bless America and her servicemen and women. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor Ogle. The Honorable Ken Gray, Chief Deputy State's Attorney, will now read aloud the names of deceased veterans from Frankfort that are buried at Abraham Lincoln, Pleasant Hill, Rose Hill, Skyline Cemeteries, and elsewhere.
Thank you so much, Amanda. I appreciate that. Mayor Ogle, that was a very nice talk. I particularly wanted to thank retired Pastor Dale Marshall, St. Peter's retired pastor, who at the last moment, so our normal chaplain wasn't able to make it at the last minute here, we asked him to step forward, and I got to say that was one of the most beautiful prayers I've heard the time I've been doing this for some 20-odd years. So Pastor Marshall, good job. You're driven by the Spirit. I thank you, sir. Well, good morning. Thank you so much for coming out on this beautiful day. It is always my honor to be here on this Memorial Day of remembrance with everyone. I want to thank Amanda Cook, Steve Stigler, Phyllis Stigler, for compiling and keeping up to date the roll of names. I also want to thank especially VFW Post 1493 for the great parade and all they do and have done for our country and our community and for the devoted military service. These are combat veterans, ladies and gentlemen. I really want to thank them for everything they've done. Thank you, gentlemen, ladies. Appreciate that. Thank you, Mayor Ogle and VFW, for carrying on this day of remembrance. I say remembrance, for it is a day to remember all of those who have served our wonderful country. It is a day to remember those who served, who were injured, both physically and emotionally, in our country's fight for continuing freedom and liberty, and to especially remember those who paid the ultimate price for those same principles. It has often been said that freedom is not free. Indeed, the selfless act of serving one's country is a noble pursuit, and we are forever grateful for those who are willing to give it their all, even if it means laying down their own life for our freedoms. I am honored and humbled to carry on this great tradition of reading the roll of those who have served in our branches of the military and have passed on, which began with Mayor George Sangmeister of Frankfort many decades ago. It was carried on by his son, former Congressman George Sangmeister, who was one of my mentors as a young man. Congressman Sangmeister was the moving member of Congress who established the Abraham Lincoln National Cemetery, and he is buried in that hallowed ground. If there is anyone in the audience who is aware of a name that should be added to our list, please feel free to contact the VFW or myself or the Village of Frankfort. They will get that information to me so we can add the names to the list. They basically only need to be a veteran who's passed away, that lives or lived. They may be retired now and living in Florida or Texas or wherever, but if they lived in Frankfort or Frankfort Township, then we'd appreciate the name if they've passed away. Thank you. Okay, the reading of the roll. These are the names of those who have served our country with honor and distinction and are buried at Rose Hill Cemetery. Edwin Brandow, George Brandow, Lloyd W. Brandow, Ronald O. Elwell, Russell J. Elwell, George Heisner, Arthur Conrad Mark Jr., Frank Mark, Walter Mark, Henry Ross, Jacob Ross. Those veterans who are buried at Abraham Lincoln National Cemetery. Wendell Anderson, Thomas M. Allen, Ronald William Atkinson, Neil M. Baker, Janet Bates, Michael Allen Beebe, David Lee Benson, John H. Benson, Albert O. Bashansky, Brian J. Bilecki, Sonny Blackburn, George E. Blass, William G. Blocker, Albert M. Bodine, Wayne Bracken, Leonard J. Brainer, Glenn A. Bruce, Gary P. Cheatham, James Clark, Thomas A. Cole, George J. Coles, Clark Cookingham, Robert L. Chrissy, Louis Chakowski, Bob L. Dalton, Richard A. DeWolf, Gilbert Durazio, John E. Dunham, Reggie Ellisons, Tim Engstrom, D.C. Epperson, Joseph G. Every, John E. Fedak Jr., Daniel J. Filipiak, David H. Finnegan, Herschel J. Floyd, Charles Foote, Francis X. Gayon, Robert W. Garrett, Edward J. Geisler Jr., John A. Glaubke, Tara D. Graveline, Frank Oliver Gray Jr., William D. Griffith Sr., Leonard A. Ham, Chester E. Hankowski, John J. Hanson, Calvert E. Heath Jr., Joseph G. Hebbard Sr., Vincent L. Herman, Robert A. Herrick, Leonardus H. Hain, Gerald W. Howard, Patrick C. Jesse, Clarence Jones, Patrick H. Jordan, Kenneth W. Kaiser, Eugene Kameg, Carl W. Kelling Jr., William H. Krosky, John L. Cunart, James G. Lally, Joseph A. Lentees, John Lindemulder, Thomas P. McCoskey, Robert L. Mansell, Charles P. Margaron, Anthony Marine Jr., Thomas P. Martin, Richard M. Matlaws, Lyle MacArthur, W. Stevens McCarthy, Robert T. McGill, Edward I. Melby, Donald R. Melcher, Rusty Meyer, George R. Mistro, William J. Mix, Martin J. Mobeck, Robert H. Moore, Larry Morgan, Hans D. Mosch, George D. Moyle, James R. Murray Sr., Raymond J. Mizkovitz, James L. O'Brien, Michael Ray O'Brien, Howard L. Pample, Kilo Panici, Hedrick E. Partee, Frank Picetto, Bobby L. Pentrala, Michael J. Pisturzi, Bruce R. Pletch, Ralph G. Port, Ronald J. Porter, Mel G. Preventure, Thomas A. Putman, Philip J. Raven, Ronald C. Reed, Frank Renz, Morgan W. Roderick, Richard S. Roscoe, Thomas L. Sandin, George E. Sangmeister, John W. Scanlon, Donald L. Schofield, Ronald A. Senesac, James H. Sexton, Dale L. Sherwin, George W. Schultz, Leroy A. Skinkus, Richard Skopik, Vincent A. Sola, Stephen J. Salava, Chester Soltise, Colin E. Sorensen, Gerald C. Squirut, John R. Stack, Cyril Strezzo, Antonio Sutera, Frank J. Scalish, Darrell Smith, Raymond Smith, Ronald H. Smith, Reverend Laverne Smith, William Smith, Eric Spengler, Tom Stack, Robert L. Stanek, Stanley Staton, Arnold J. Steves, Chester Stefanik, Roy Stellwagen, James R. Stern, Meade Stuckey, Richard Suranovic, Fred Surya, Donald Swanberg, George R. Swanberg, Matt Szymanski, Joseph Telesferi, Antonio Tortorici, Bruno F. Trento, Martin Tuck, Alexander Melvin Turner, Sylvester Tyler, Arthur Vencura, Willard Van Eck, Henry Van Winkle, Thomas Vogler, Edward Vollrath, Lambert Vollrath, John Wagner, Curtis L. Waldvogel, William Walker, Jeremiah Wall, James Warren, Charles Weber, Cheryl Whitegroat, Fred B. Wietendorf, Andrew Wershing, William White, Everett Whitmore, Charles Wingler, John L. Wiat, Henry V. Wood, Joseph Samadich, Paul Zenzina, those buried at Skyline Cemetery, Gerald Abbey, Arthur E. Anderson, Alexander A. Antusis, Melvin Bartles, Eugene Batson, William Batson, Melvin Bernardi, James A. Bernero, William Blau, Edward Brown, Leland Dalton, John P. DeVos, Glenn E. Farrell, Herbert B. Hardy, Clarence Harms, Milton W. Harms, Edward L. Hartley, Irvin Holm, Frederick Holzaffel Sr., Henry Hosbach, Frederick H. Kook, Leroy Cluth, George Martin, Donald C. Myers, Harry E. Miller, Ernest J. Nelvilli, Glenn Nissen, Oliver F. Pass, Fred K. Paxton, James A. Rafoff, Frank Sartori, Harold Ellsworth Schiffler, Gottfried Shinkowski, Orville Shinkowski, Howard J. Seaman, William D. Shanafelt, George F. Schaus, Donald E. Stephen, John Joseph Tyler, Casimir M. Mochak, Vincent N. Zaranti, Andrew Zink, those veterans buried elsewhere. Jerome K. Ackert, Donald A. Eggleston, Leland B. Alderson, Fermi A. Alderson, John Alfano, Rudolph Y. Alagrucci, Kenneth A. Allen, Thomas M. Allen, Gus Anagnos, Herman S. Anderson, Nels Anderson, Robert L. Anderson, William J. Andrisiak, John P. Angelis, James R. Angio, Timothy J. Arman, Clarence H. Bach, Richard Bacino, Al Baggs, James Ballett, Norbert Ballett, Harold Baldacci, Melvin A. Bartels, Robert T. Baxter, Hugo Becker, Chester Bellowan, Joseph A. Bella, Ernest H. Bennett, David Lee Benson, Catherine L. Berkery, Batista Bertolotti, Robert C. Besson, William L. Blakemore, John C. Blansett Sr., Norton Blaylock, Richard J. Bach, Warren Harold Bach, Edward J. Badong, Jack Bone, Thomas F. Bolin, Harold A. Bormet, Eugene Brackman, William S. Branford, Paul Brandow, Marvin F. Bremer, Leo B. Brennan, Melvin R. Brink, Henry C. Brinkmeyer, Richard D. Bruno, August O. Butcher, Alice M. Buddy, Phil Bundy, Angelo J. Caliendo, William Thomas Campbell, Don V. Capp, John F. Caparelli, Paul M. Carlson, John G. Cernauskas, Paul Chamberlain, Jack D. Chiapetta, John E. Corley, Patrick F. Connolly, Cornelius J. Cook, Jack Cook, Noah W. Crane, Frederick Cross, Edward E. Crowder, Joseph P. Cryon, James P. Cummings, Joseph B. Currier, Alan J. Curry, Lawrence Chaswitz, James N. Daly, Albert L. Diefenbach, Frank E. David, George E. Davies, Gino DeRay, James J. Delaney, William V. DeLauder, David P. Detmer, Neil O. DeVore Sr., Frederick H. Dinger, Dominic A. Dirutili, this one's the toughest one, Dominic A. Dirutini, Dominic A. Dirutini, forgive me if I mispronounced that, Thomas H. Donovan, Russell A. Dubrow, Stanley Charles Douglas, Francis Doyle, John Dorsch, John A. Duncan, John DeRocker, William F. Earhart III, Gene R. Tillis, Thomas Edward Ellis, Alan P. Engelhart, Harry L. Engeldow, Robert J. Erdy, Andrew M. Evans, Walter S. Farron, Lee W. Filippo, David H. Finnegan, Nicholas Fisher, Herman Fleischem, Henry Flenchy, Frank Felicci, Thomas J. Frangella, Herman L. Frank, James Freeman, William A. Friedel, Garetano Kenneth Foucault, James Robert Garofalo, Warren H. Garrett, Anthony S. Gasparo, Frank Robert Giamato, Dale Janens, Eugene J. Girardi Sr., Ricardo A. Girardi, Harry M. Gerkitz, John G. Jernauskas, Ted Gerndt, Frederick J. Glatz, Edward Golden, John Golden, Trevor Golden, Sebastian Gonlag, Carl G. Gren, Leonard B. Gromnicki, Edward Gross, Leo H. Gruzewski, George A. Haddad, Lloyd R. Hall, William J. Halperin, James W. Hanna, William C. Hardy, Ernest A. Hargison, Raymond Harms, Daniel P. Hatton, Charles E. Hecht, Calvin A. Hine, Lawrence Hobson, Lester R. Hochhalter, John Hogan, Lawrence Hogan, Leo Thomas Hogan, William R. Hoffelson, Leon Holman, Edward Hooton, James J. Horvath, Robert W. Rara, Dean Paul Hulho Sr., Lawrence A. Estelle, Margaret Estelle, John S. Ivers, Robert Yan, Michael J. Jamrock, Ignatius J. Janusik, William R. Jensen, Albert Johnson, James W. Johnson, John W. Johnson, Walter J. Johnson, Roy Jones, Norman W. Udis, Richard Kazmarski, Wayne Karstensen, Edward J. Kosarski Sr., Herman G. Kautz, Ronald J. Keene, Herman J. Kaiser, James C. Keeler, Richard Keller, Thomas Kellerman, James J. Kelly, Thomas K. Kennard, Edward R. Kowandowski, John King, Richard Klotz, Leroy Marvin Kluth, Barney F. Kamak, Eugene Kamek, Orville Knierim, Joseph G. Kordick, Jerry E. Kovar, Stanley J. Kozasik, Joseph R. Kroll, Stanley Kresmer, Harold G. Crone, Robert W. Cross, Stephen F. Kubik, Andrew Kiebrick, Robert A. Koo, Dennis J. Kuda, Howard George Larson, Roy Larson, William R. Lawrence, Lester L. Lair, Dominic Leonardo, William Lester, Gerald E. Lichtenwalter, Carl Lindy, David Lindstrom, Raymond E. Lorden, John P. Luskus, Walter Frank Madsen, Marvin A. Mager, Michael Mahaney, Donald W. Maher, Richard A. Mango, Gerald W. Mark, Pete A. Marcunas, Louis P. Machidi Jr., Samuel Matthews III, James C. McCarthy, James McCauley, Billy G. McClard, Robert McCann, John Otis McCleary, Frank C. McClenahan, James D. McElroy, John R. McKendry, James McLemore, Joseph Madrano, Robert Mears, Yolando Malai, Louis D. Menigan, Robert Mensick, George E. Merica, James Marion, Gerald Messix, Tom L. Metz, Joseph Metzger, Michael Mikas, Robert Mills, Paul Mizkovitz Jr., Russell Morgan, Warren Mankey, Bernard L. Mandela, Gerald R. Mankowski, Charles P. Margaron, Lawrence Marquardt, Robert Martinson, Wayne Massey, Ira Maynard, Ralph C. Matuziak, Michael L. McCoos, Mark Monaghan Jr., Frank Mondry, Henry J. Motel, James Moy, Hans W. Mueller, Arthur C. Mullen Jr., Bruce A. Mullen, Vito Murabito, Robert E. Murphy, John Leo Naraki, Joseph Nichols, Nicholas J. Nijakowski, Everett H. Nissen, John Nortzel, Ben Novelli Jr., Edward Oakley, Lawrence E. Oglesby, Morris Ackerland, Henry J. Oliveri, Sr., Robert E. O'Neill, Robert J. O'Meara, Theodore Osich, Paul Oswald, Douglas Osborne, Lawrence A. Paha, Joseph J. Pelesny, Rudolph Piloto, Mario J. Pascarella, Philip Pascarella, George F. Pasquier, Rudolph Pavlaka, Leonard Pearson, Leonard H. Pechtold, Casimir Peckerless, Bruce R. Pedgram Sr., William Peters, John A. Peterson, David R. Phillips, Charles Bizanca, Angelo Pisturzi, Frank A. Plesser, Edward J. Polito, Edward F. Prusser, Scott B. Price, James H. Price Sr., Henry F. Prokosky, Francis B. Puliz, Joseph Puliz, Louis A. Rabelhofer, William Rankin Sr., Charles A. Reedy, Paul M. Rebus, Ronald C. Reed, John P. Reedy, Irwin H. Reimer, Alex A. Rembus, Catherine H. Reynolds, Frederick M. Reister, Lee R. Rinker, Walter Ritt, Manuel C. Rod, Daniel J. Reamer, Patrick Rogers, William M. Rogue, Donald S. Rozalowski, John E. Rossi, Rivaldo T. Rossini, Robert Roth, Dominic Rotondo Jr., Louis Stanley Rudnicki, Pompeo Ruggieri, Ronald Rezka, Don Sabatino, Robert S. Sadak, Charles F. Samek, Albert L. Saviano, Matt Sako, Rodney Schaefer, John J. Schilling, Joe Schmidt, Alfred Schrank, Roy J. Schuch, George R. Schultz, David A. Shump, Harold Schwab, Frank Stanley Sedzlars, John Selheimer, William I. Schenefeld, Thomas Z. Shannon, Walter J. Shatkus, Albert R. Shaw, Francis G. Sheridan, Charlie Shields, Jim Shields, Ralph J. Show, Paul R. Schult, George Shutak, George D. Shutak, Frederick A. Siekman, Eric P. Simmons, Gordon E. Slade, Walter J. Smielek Jr., Charles R. Smith, Dudley H. Smith, Paul J. Sosnowski, Sylvester S. Sosnowski, Joseph Sotosanto, Roger W. Southard, Daniel R. Spur Jr., Stade, Michael R. Stanich, Ivan Stankuz, Lawrence J. Stasadis, William Staton, Gerald Stillman, Roderick W. Story, Clarence Stunkel, Leonard Stunkel, William Stunkel, Benedict H. Staracco, Thomas Strader, Ronald R. Stromberg, Melvin Stutzrim, Larry Subert, Bernard Sundberg, Robert Sweeten, Donald Swinford, Albert R. Sylvester, Joseph J. Zarmak, John Edward Taylor, Michael M. Thompson, Art Thompson Jr., William R. Talameri, Philip Toth, R. Harold Trezise Sr., Albert C. Treble Jr., Henry A. Tumbarello, Stanley A. Tylinski, Lawrence L. Unger, Dominic Venuzzo, Joe A. Villarreal, Matt Valutis, William Wace, Andrew Walchick, William J. Walker, Fred A. Wallerstedt, William M. Walsh, Ralph D. Ward, Clement W. Warner, Robert Warren, James Weingardner, John T. Welling, Howard Werner, Walter Werner, Charles Wirt, Emil Willie, Howard Willis, Anthony C. Williams, Matthew David Williams, Wayne F. Worth, Lester E. Wuschke, Ronald W. Yates, Van Earl Yunker, Theodore J. Zane, Lawrence F. Zimmerman. Those veterans buried at Twining Cemetery: Andrew Barge, Howard W. Duke, Uriah Hardy, Andrew T. Home, Edwell A. Rabb. Those veterans buried at Frankfort Cemetery: Frank Abbott, George Bussey, Donald Carroll, Eugene Eisenbrandt, Melvin Eisenbrandt, Andrew Eisenbrandt, Richard J. Folletti, Harry E. Gibson, Ted Gibson, Clifford Grizzled, Walter Hawkinson, Glenn G. Jacobs, Joseph Mashkin, Dalton Miller, David William Nelson, Frank J. Reitz, Edward Stippen, Harold J. Wingler, Joseph W. Zimmerman. Those veterans buried at Pleasant Hill Cemetery: Nick Gaducci, Irby J. Albright, Nick Altavilla, Jimmy John Altavilla, Stephen Amir, Alma Bailey, John Bailey, Anthony Ballencount, Julius A. Barnes, Richard Barnes, Kenneth Baumber, Norman W. Baumgartner, Victor K. Beckman, Louis Belcher, Edward H. Bells, Clark W. Bennett, Robert R. Bennett, Raymond Bettenhausen, John N. Benetti, Cyril Blackwell, Thomas Blaney, Kenneth Bloomer, Stanley Bobson, Henry P. Bach, Jerry C. Bach, Donald Betcher, Arthur Bogaz, Kenneth Boonstra, Sam Bredlinger, Norman Bree, Joseph Bozira, Edward Bukowinski, Ruth Burns, Leonard R. Busen, John Caldwell, Evelyn Canterbury, Ray Canterbury, Carl Cardinal, Lenore Cardinal, Donald Carlson, Kenneth Carlson, Mac Carson, Horace N. Cachetta, Stephen Chambers, Walter J. Cheney, Lloyd Cleveland, William Cleveland, Kenneth Cohn, Terry L. Cossart, Robert Crutchfield, Thomas A. Curran, Chester Zanata, Anna P. Dayan, William J. Dayan, William Dangel, Albert L. Diefenbach, Russell Leon Davis, Donald DeHart, Jacob DePorto, Harry D. Arcole, George Dervaquito, Cornelius DeWitt, Gordon K. Dillon, Klaus B. Ditchler, William Dugan, Ambrose Doty, Robert P. Desden, Ralph Drowley, Bruce Ebert, Chester Ebert, Edmund Ebert, Jack L. Edmondson, George Robert Elsner, Eric H. Erickson, Azel Erickson, Robert D. Evans, Michael Flachek, Joseph Ficker, Herbert P. Folkers, Herbert Folkers Jr., Johnson Folkers, Dale Fordyce, Ronald D. Fox, Ronald J. Fredericks, Robert Fredine, Robert Fry, Leonard Fries, Robert E. Fritz, Fred Fulsang, Robert M. Gaba, Udell W. Gay, Delmar Janens, Donald Janens, Harry Janens, William Janens, Earl Gearman, Sam Giordano, John W. Glisson, James M. Grady, Donald R. Graves, Alvin Gullickson, William Guzika, Kennard Hawkinson, Emo T. Haas, Sam Hageman, Richard Hansen Jr., Henry Harnack, Ronald W. Harnack, Roland Hatcher, Bernard J. Hauser, Joseph Hebard, William Hecht, Charles Hagan, Melvin A. Hine, Clarence Heisner, Roy M. Hensley Jr., Raymond Hernandez, Ralph Leonard Hitz, Charles Hornback, Walter Horton, Harry Hotchkin, Robert Dean Hull, John Henry Yeager, Leonard Japp Jr., Leroy Jarkow, Gary Johansson, George H. Johnson, Kenneth Johnson, Olaf A. Johnson, Roy Johnson, Joseph B. Jolly, John Keller, Frank Kerr, Joseph Kerwin, Warren W. Keck, Dennis Kimsey, Rupert Kinnery, Thomas Kinnery, Orville Knierim, William Knipple, Robert Kolar, Stanley Kostecki, John Kodas, Frank Kovar, Leslie Kraft, Erwin A. Kruger, Richard J. Krynicki, John Coos, Albert M. Lally, James Albert Larimore, George Leffler, John Leffler, Wendell M. Leffler, Frank Ligero, Frank E. Ligero, Maynard W. Lukert, Glenn Lewis, Troy Lyerly, Klaus Peter Lichtenfeld, Bruno Liento, James Edward Logan, George Ludolph, Lloyd P. Luring, Edgar Lund, Robert O. Lundquist, John Maddox, Andrew J. Melito, James McCarthy, James McDermott, Charles McMenamin, Francis J. McNally, Thomas Myers, George Martin Mickelson, Michael Mikas, Robert W. P. Mitchell, John C. Moulter, John Montoya, Henry J. Montel, Louis Marino, Ralph E. Morrison, Charles L. Moskop, Fred Muff, James Munch, Jack Munger, Wilfred Niedringhaus, Robert Newgren, Ralph Neeland, Ronald H. Nevada, Donald H. Oliveri, Charles Olson, Philip J. Ortigal, William Osman, David Parks, Charles L. Pasca, James A. Patterson, Leonard Peterson Jr., Herbert E. Phillips, Clarence Pieper, Emmerich J. Piller, Marion J. Pamacala, Wayne Price, James Pyle, Clarence J. Radke, Russell Ragsdell, Robert Reka, Albert Redman, Fred Reimers, William Reimers, Jack A. Rinaldi, Daniel Rarica, Robert Reynolds, James Rice, Ronald Rimkus, David Roberts, William Robinson, Earl Rousseau, Eris Rudman, Dr. Irving Rudman, William J. Rung, Frank R. Saletta, Brent Sanders, Julius J. Sandy, Paul Scaletta, James J. Scanlon, Richard T. Shedicke, Rodney Schaefer, Herbert J. Shoup, Alan Schramm, Norbert Schroeder, George Schultz, Earl Scott, Delbert F. Seaman, Percy Severson, Forrest Shaw, Clarence Ciano Jr., Raleigh V. Sinks, Woodrow Simmons, Frank F. Sinat, Scott C. Skoglund, John Valent, Richard C. Wagner, Paul Wessel Jr., Emmanuel S. White, Walter G. Wierzbicki, Ronald Zolkowski. That concludes the reading of the roll. May God bless them, their families, and continue to bless this great country. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ken. Wonderful as always. We appreciate you honoring Frankfort's veterans each year in this special way. We sincerely appreciate your commitment. The Frankfort VFW will now present a 21-gun rifle salute to our fallen comrades, followed by taps played by the Hickory Creek Middle School Band's Ben Hayward and director Allison Bowman. Thank you to everybody who worked hard to bring this ceremony to life today. And thank you to all of you for joining us this morning and honoring our fallen and deceased veterans. Your participation in this important Frankfort tradition means a lot to us and the families. Please enjoy the rest of your holiday.